We left off last video getting our project set up with our data and our images, and I left you with the challenge of building the VStack. So hopefully that went smooth. Again, a lot of repetition. It's from what we did before. However, we're going to build that right now because that is the first building block of our grid. So let's get right to it and see how my code compares to yours if you did that. So of course we're going to want a VStack, right? Because we have the image at the top and the title underneath it. So like I just said, image. And what is that image? That's going to be name, right? Remember when we were doing the weather app, we did system name because that was SF symbol. Well, now we actually have images in our bundle. So now we do image name, and then the string we pass in, let's do app clip. There we go. So there's our image. Obviously that's huge, that's way bigger than we want. And if you remember what I said you're gonna do with your images almost always is .resizable, probably like 99.9% of the time. And that makes it look even more ridiculous, but we need to do that. So now we do a frame and we're gonna give it a width and height of 90 by 90. And again, that is just me dialing in those numbers, figuring it out. So if your numbers weren't the same as mine, like you didn't get it wrong, like you just dialed it in differently than I did. So now let's put our text in, right? So text in our framework name, and we're kind of hard coding this. We have the object of framework, but we don't quite have that framework object on our grid view yet. So we'll kind of inject this specific framework later. We're hard coding values now just to get our UI set up. And to be honest, that's usually how I build the apps. Before I have all my data from like a network call or something like that, I fill it in with like mock data or dummy data just to make sure the structure is correct. And then I can kind of like inject the data as needed. So just a little tidbit there. So we'll call this app clips, right? So there you go. Now that text is kind of small, kind of skinny. Again, we want this kind of big, bold, chunky. So let's do font. Now here's where we're going to mix it up a little bit from what we did last time. Last time we weren't kind of supporting dynamic type. We were hard coding our font values. So if I do font, now I'm just going to do dot title, and you can see, well, I'm just going to do dot first to show you the options. So dot, and now you see, body, call out, caption, caption 2, footnote, headline, large title, subheading, right? These are different categories of like font sizes, but this will support dynamic type, right? So if I just do title 2, now whatever the user has a setting for a dynamic type, this will respect that. But it's still not bold like we want, but we can put a font weight on top of that, right? So font weight, and let's do semi-bold, right? But again, I'll just do dot to show you, right? Black, bold, heavy, light, medium, regular. So we're going to do semi-bold there, as you can see. So that's the basic text. But if you remember when I gave you the challenge, I said some of these framework names are long and our grid squares are only so big. So we're going to need the text to be able to shrink to fit the name if need be. So there's a couple more modifiers we got to put on our text for that. Scaled to fit, there you go. And then now what we want to do is we want to give it a minimum scale factor, and we'll say 0.5. So what this does here is this says, hey, you now have the ability to shrink if needed for the text, but we only want you to shrink so much, right? We don't want you to shrink to like 10% and be unreadable. Now, this number, you could dial it in, you could change it if need be, but we'll say only go down to 50%. And to be honest with you, that might even be like too small. We'll say 60, but you can see how you can dial that in, right? So the smallest this text is gonna go, if it's like a really long name, is 60% of the original size. So that handles our font scaling when our name is super long. Now, something different we're going to do in this app is we're going to refactor as we go rather than wait till everything's done to refactor. And especially something like this VStack here, we know if you look at the detail view on the screen here, like we're going to reuse that VStack in another view. So this is going to be reusable for sure. So again, I'm going to copy, and I put the struct in here to start. We'll put it up here, so struct, and then I'll move it into its own view or file later. We'll call this framework title view, and this is going to be adjusted later on, but for now we'll do let name equal or be a string that we pass in, and then let image name also be a string that we're going to pass in. Remember how I was talking about how we're kind of hard coding this for now? Well, once we get our framework array working that we have in our data, we're actually just going to pass in a framework to this framework title view, and it's going to do everything from there. So, but for now, we're going to kind of hard code this. So now I'm going to do a command V to paste that VStack, and instead of app clip, we're going to have image name there, and then for the text here, we're just going to have name. Right, so eventually that's going to be framework.name, framework.imageName, etc. Okay, what did I mess up? I know what I messed up. Var body, right? Every view has this body that is of type some view, and then open and closed. Cool. Yeah, you can't just put the VStack in a struct. You got to put the VStack in the body. There we go. So yeah, that var body sum view should be the first thing you always type when you're creating a new view there. And I didn't conform this to 2. Man, typos everywhere. We're leaving it in though, just to show you that I'm not perfect. Developers aren't perfect. Everybody makes these kind of silly little mistakes. I'm probably making them more than usual right now just because, anytime you're talking and explaining and presenting on a video, you're not kind of like in just your code mode, if you will. But anyway, here's our framework title view refactored. So let's use it up here now. Framework title view. And now this is going to take in a name and then we'll do app clips and then an image name, which is app-clip. So if I do a resume, we should be good to go here. Cool, everything is the same, that's refactored out. All right, now for the main event of this video, let's start building our grid. Now grids were introduced in iOS 14, so they're relatively new to SwiftUI, lazy V grids and lazy H grids. So let me break that down a little bit. Lazy just means that the views get initialized as they're needed. For example, VStacks and HStacks also got a lazy version in iOS 14. So before, your whole VStack would populate. Like if you had 10 views in your VStack and maybe your each VStack was actually pretty tall on the screen, like for example, Instagram, right? If you see Instagram, the photo, the caption, that could all be one VStack, but that one VStack takes up the entire screen. So if you had 10 of those in your VStack, and it wasn't lazy, all 10 of those would load even though only one of them is showing up on the screen. So that's why lazy got introduced in iOS 14 to make it so it only kind of generates the views when they're needed. So grids are lazy by default at the moment. That's the only way you can make them. And then as you can imagine, a lazy V grid is what we're gonna build. As you can see on the screen here, that is a grid that's gonna scroll vertically. Okay, so a key component of building a grid, whether it's vertical or horizontal, is you're going to need columns or rows. Right? So columns for a vertical grid, rows for a horizontal grid. We're going to need columns because we're vertical. So for that, in our framework grid view here, let's create a variable. Let columns equal, and it's no, we got to give it a type here because we're not going to fill it just yet. So that's going to be an array of grid items. I'll explain that in a second. And that's going to equal an empty array for now. We're going to fill that array with grid items. Let's talk about a grid item. So if I type grid item, you can set your columns to be, 90 points wide. That might make sense because our frame's 90 by 90. We're going to do it a different way. But the big picture, the point, to put it super simple, you can basically give it a fixed width, height, set your fixed parameters, or you can do what we're going to do and initialize a grid item with .flexible. And we're not going to do a minimum maximum width. You could do that if you want. Like it's flexible. Here's the minimum size it can be. Here's the maximum size it can be. We're just going to do flexible with no parameters. So there is no min max. And what flexible does is based on how many columns you have, it's going to fill that screen. Let's create the beginnings of our lazy V grid. And then we're going to come back to these columns to show you that in action. So here in the body of our framework grid view, right, we have our framework title view that we just built. We want that to be part of our grid. So down here, we can type lazy V grid here. And you can see you can have, just like VStacks, right? You can have columns, alignment, spacing, more stuff, or you can just have columns and content. Now here's a little tricky thing with SwiftUI. And this is a little bit of an experience thing that you're going to learn over time, is sometimes the autocompletes can be more confusing than just typing it out the more simple way. So watch when I do autocomplete on contents and column, right? Like, what is this? So columns, it is giving me the grid items of fixed 20, or like that's what we kind of demonstrated up there. So for columns, I definitely want just our columns array that we created up here on line 12. That's what I want to pass in. But now this is what I'm talking about, like start menu token, end menu token. Like, I have no idea what that even means. It gives me these text placeholders. Like it's just much easier to type the lazy V grid like this. And again, you'll learn this over time. Just lazy V grid, kind of type it out yourself. Columns, right? I know I'm going to want my columns array, and then literally just an open and closed closure there. And we're getting two previews because it looks like we have two different views in our body. We have our lazy V grid and our framework title is separate, but we want to move the framework title into the lazy V grid, right? So it looks no different. And you want to know why? It's because we only have one column. There's only one column in our array. And if I'm highlighting the lazy V grid here, you can see the red frame. You can see that one column is taking up the entire width of the screen. Okay, cool. So let's add a comma here, hit return, and we're going to add another grid item with flexible. So that'll give us 2 rows. So return, enter. Okay, so now we have 2 rows, hit resume, and you can see, well, we only have one framework title view here. Let's put in another. Let's go crazy, right? Put in a bunch. So here you go. There's 2 columns because we did 2 grid items of flexible. And again, eventually our grid is going to take our array from our dummy data of our frameworks, but we're hard coding now just to play with the layout and for me to show you this. So you can probably imagine what happens if we add a third grid item here in our columns, right? We're just adding more columns every time we do this. Hit resume. There you go. 3 columns, just like that. Guess what happens when you do 4? Resume 4, right? You see where I'm going with this. But now you can see our UI might be starting to break down a little bit because we made our vertical stack for our framework 90 by 90, right? So you can imagine if you wanted a lot of columns, you would probably have to adjust that. Let's do 5 just to show, you know, this kind of gets silly here. Again, I'm just kind of illustrating this. Okay, so that's super cramped, but you can see our text shrinking. That's why we put that minimum scale factor on our text. Okay, so let's get back to what we're actually gonna do here. Delete 2 of those grid items. We definitely want 3 of them here. So 3 in our array, hit resume. There you go. That looks more like what we're trying to build. Again, when we have our real data in there. And that's what we're gonna do in the next video. This video is just setting up the basic structure of our grid. In the next video, we're going to work on getting it showing the frameworks in our array and getting our grid looking like you see here on that design. So exciting stuff. Let's go.